Right now at this time, we're going to be having a gentleman who is the Executive Director for the National Integrity Action, Jamaica's affiliate of Transparency International, the Global Civil Society Coalition Against Corruption. He's also visiting honorary professor at the St. Arthur Lewis Institute at Mona. As an academic, he has taught for 40 years at, I asked what, I'm not sure what you can't trust even the water these days. As an academic, he has taught for over 40 years at Mona. He's been writing, he's been researching, and teaching extensively on Caribbean democratic governance, in the course of which he's received more honors and awards than we can count. He probably have a room just to put up all them things, them trophies, plaques, etc. A Jamaican Rhodes Scholar. Put your hands together for that, man. That's a lifetime achievement. And he's an Oxford PhD in political science. He was the only person from the Caribbean invited to speak at the 110th anniversary of the Rhodes Scholarships celebrated at Oxford University in September 2013. That's not an achievement. As a civil society advocate, he was instrumental as founder and co-founder of Jamaica's Election Observer Group, Citizen Action for Free and Fair Elections, CAFE, and the University and Allied Workers Union, one of the country's leading trade unions. He's currently a member of the Council of Partnership for Jamaica, chaired by the Prime Minister, Portia Simpson-Miller. He has served as a consultant to a number of hemispheric and international organizations, including the OAS, the Carter Center, the World Bank, the USAID, DFID, Transparency International, and the UNDP, amongst others. Most recently, in 2014, UNESCO appointed him National Consultant to review the anti-doping provisions in sports in Jamaica, one of 7 countries whose compliance with the United Nations Convention Against Doping in Sports is currently being evaluated. His name, ladies and gentlemen, is Professor Trevor Munroe, and his presentation is going to be dealing with the role of NGOs and civil societies in the fight against corruption. Put your hands together for Professor Trevor Munroe.
May have been a Freudian slip a moment ago when Cleon said that I am an honorary visiting professor at UWI Mocha. So I completely accept the designation. Chairman Cleon, ladies and gentlemen, particularly so many friends from law enforcement and Justice Department agencies who are present here today, may I begin this presentation by first expressing very special congratulations to Dirk, to the Office of the Contractor General, and to the OCG staff for conceiving, for planning, for executing this inaugural anti-corruption conference. And in particular, I think we're all very excited by the focus on empowering the new generation. Needless to say, myself and National Integrity Action responded enthusiastically and positively when the OCG approached us to be part of the sponsors of this conference. And so we were here yesterday, and so we are here today. And I really want to take a moment just to congratulate the Jamaica Youth Theatre for that extraordinary, vibrant, and dramatic presentation yesterday. It does demonstrate the potential of our young people. I've been asked to present to you on the role of NGOs and civil society organizations in the fight against corruption. And I think this is an appropriate topic because there is likely to be much discussion in the coming weeks and months about civil society organizations and NGOs in the context of a resolution now before the Parliament looking at how far and to what extent these organizations should be regulated or otherwise. And therefore I begin by sharing with you an understanding of what an NGO, what a civil society organization is not, and what it is, so that we have a clear picture what we're talking about. I suggest there are three definitions I want to share with you. One particularly academic, as we'd expect, coming from the London School of Economics. And it says the following. Civil society is the arena of uncoerced collective action around shared interest, purposes, and values. In theory, its institutional forms are distinct from those of the state, the family, and market, though in practice, the boundaries between state, civil society, family, and market are often complex, blurred, and negotiated. The second definition comes from Civicus, the global organization of civil society bodies, and they say that civil society is the arena outside of the family, the state, and the market where people associate to advance a common interest. The third and final definition I share with you is from the International Monetary Fund. In their fact sheet, they speak of, and here I quote, the IMF uses the term civil society organization to refer to the wide range of citizens' associations that exist virtually in all member countries to provide benefits, services, or political influence to specific groups within society. CSOs, the IMF definition continues, includes business forums, faith-based organizations, labor unions, local community groups, non-governmental organizations, philanthropic foundations, and think tanks. Branches of government, government agencies and legislators, individual businesses, political parties, and the media are usually excluded. End of quotes. From these definitions, we can infer that NGOs, civil society organizations, are characterized by four features, which I'd like to share with you. Number one, independence from government. Number two, not-for-profit. Number three, non-criminal. Number four, not an opposition party. And I may add, not a party at all. Civil society organizations and NGOs are, by definition, cannot contest for elected office. NIA, in fitting these characteristics, is one example of a CSO NGO in Jamaica. These organizations, you will immediately see, are the legitimate expression of citizens in our country and around the world, exercise of two fundamental human rights, embodied in both the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and Jamaica's Charter of Fundamental Rights. That is, the right to freedom of association, Article 20 of the UN Declaration, and our Charter, Sections 10, and the right to freedom of expression, the UN Declaration, Article 19, and the Jamaican Charter, Section 9. It is important to understand that these organizations are grounded in fundamental rights and principles, because we shall talk later about what are the implications of seeking to restrict or constrain their activity. It is important to note for our purposes, for the discussion that we shall undertake later, that CSOs and NGOs have experienced rapid growth in most states in the international community over the last 25 years. The number of NGOs in the United States is estimated at 1.5 million. In India, about 2 million in 2009. In Russia, 270,000. In Jamaica, an assessment of civil society quoted a 2003 Inter-American Development Bank study, estimated that there are over 5,700 community-based organizations, CBOs, over 200 non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and approximately 30 umbrella organizations. That's the IDB study 10 or so years ago. Of course, in Jamaica and across the global community, CSOs and NGOs are focused on the widest range of issues: environmental issues, children's issues, human rights issues, and of course, for our specific purpose, anti-corruption issues. In passing, I believe it is of some importance to note some of the main reasons for this rapid growth over the last 25 years of civil society and non-governmental organizations. First, declining confidence in political parties and organizations, leading to a steady fall-off in membership across all countries in the world in which a study has been done. Secondly, a growing opinion that governments serve powerful private special interests more than the public interest. A recent study done in 2013, the Global Corruption Barometer, found that 53% of the persons surveyed in 107 countries, 114,000 people interviewed, felt that government served very special powerful interest and not the public interest. And that varied from Greece, 80-odd%, for obvious reasons, and the United States, United Kingdom, which were around 60%, Jamaica was 50-odd%. Thirdly, increased citizen concern to advance specific causes, as distinct from trying to impact public policy in general. And finally, a spirit of voluntarism, which grew in the last 25 years in many different countries. Given the reasons for their growth and the fundamental rights which they express, it is easy to understand the functions which civil society organizations and NGOs fulfill. First of all, advocacy, arguing for particular causes. Secondly, service provision. Many CSOs, NGOs provide services of one sort or another. Thirdly, awareness building, whether in relation to the environment, human rights, or anti-corruption issues. And fourthly, public engagement and mobilization. The importance of CSOs, NGOs, the diversity of their interests, and the significance of their functions means that the widest range of multilateral institutions, international organizations, and international development partners, the IMF, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the UNDP, formally engage CSOs in countries across the world for one reason or another. In this context, we can now turn specifically to the role of these important institutions in the fight against corruption. We begin by repeating the definition you have heard in so many presentations within the last day and a half. Corruption, the abuse of position, in whatever sphere, in the public sphere, and I wish to emphasize in the private sphere, business and the private sector, in the market, as well as in civil society, for illicit gain. This is an acknowledged cancer eating away at society and its institutions nationally, regionally, and internationally. Equally, it is acknowledged that the poor and the vulnerable are the earliest and most immediate victims of this cancer. Hence, for example, Jamaica's national security policy is very clear. Please read it on the Cabinet Secretary's website. It identifies corruption in all its manifestations of public and elected officials of different institutions of the state as the number one threat, the number one clear and present danger to Jamaica's national security and economic development. Similarly, the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, to which Jamaica is a signatory, declares, quote, that corruption undermines the legitimacy of public institutions and strikes at society, moral order and justice, as well as the comprehensive development of peoples. The forward by the UN General Secretary General, as he was then, Kofi Annan, to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, describes corruption as an insidious plague that undermines democracy and the rule of law, leads to violations of human rights, distorts markets, erodes the quality of life, and allows organized crime, terrorism, and other threats to human society to flourish. Kofi Annan continued with an observation, which I believe you have heard before in this conference, particularly relevant to Jamaica at the present moment. Corruption hurts the poor disproportionately by diverting funds intended for development, undermining a government's ability to provide basic services, feeding inequality and injustice, and discouraging foreign aid and investment. May I pause for a moment to say that the last assessment of inequality in the Western Hemisphere, done in May 2013 by the International Monetary Fund, found that Jamaica was second only to Suriname in the levels of income inequality in the hemisphere, ahead of Brazil, ahead of Haiti, on the Gini coefficient, which is used to measure these matters. Discouraging foreign aid and investment, the Global Competitiveness Report 2014-2015 identifies corruption in Jamaica in the top 3 of the most problematic factors for doing business in this country. You can infer the implications for job creation and employment. Given the insidious nature of this plague and its destructive impact on society, on economy and governance, there's consensus that while government must act against corruption, and the governmental bodies here represented must act against corruption, governmental authorities alone cannot deal effectively with corruption. Civil society organizations and NGOs have a critical role to play in the fight against corruption. In fact, the involvement of CSOs and NGOs is not just an option, it is a treaty obligation. Article 3 of the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, which Jamaica has ratified, requires state parties to the convention, including Jamaica, and here I quote, to create, maintain, and strengthen mechanisms to encourage participation by civil society and non-governmental organizations in efforts to prevent corruption, end of quote. Similarly, not an option, but a treaty obligation, Article 13 of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, now ratified by 174 countries, including Jamaica, indicates, and here I quote, each state party shall take appropriate measures to promote the active participation of civil society, non-governmental organizations, and community organizations in the prevention of and the fight against corruption, and to raise public awareness regarding the existence, causes, and gravity of, and the threat posed by corruption. The key role of CSOs and NGOs is therefore a matter of regional and global consensus, and so is the obligation of governments to support, not to restrict, to facilitate, not to constrain that role in the fight against corruption. Not surprisingly, in many countries, for example, recently in India and Brazil, anti-corruption NGOs mobilize hundreds of thousands to challenge the impunity of the corrupt. Not the impunity of the constables and the small people, but the impunity of the corrupt in high places, and to strengthen anti-corruption legislation. In other countries, in contrast, in Russia, Jordan, Kenya, to name a few, governments are restricting civil society organizations in breach of their obligations under the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and in violation of the fundamental right to freedom of association, of assembly, and of speech. This trend, should it raise its ugly head, must be resisted in Jamaica and not be allowed to take root here or in any other country of the Caribbean. Equally, civil society organizations and their funders, foreign and local, have an obligation to practice what they preach, to be transparent, to be accountable, to respect the law and cultural norms of the countries in which they operate. And of course, civil society organizations and NGOs have a very special obligation to develop the domestic base of support in terms of funding, in terms of membership, to complement, not to substitute for, to complement the support from international development partners. In Jamaica, National Integrity Action, launched publicly in December 2011 and formally registered under the Charities Act in 2013, is the civil society organization engaged in the fight against corruption. The organization seeks to live up to the requirements of UNCAC, which we spoke of a moment ago, and to strengthen the fight against corruption in our country in a number of ways. Number one, raising public awareness, in the words of UNCAC, regarding the existence, causes, and gravity of, and the threat posed by corruption. This activity has been pursued, as many of you may recall, through full-length documentaries, The Cost of Corruption, Jamaica's Barrier to Prosperity, and the second documentary launched on International Anti-Corruption Day last year, Building Integrity, a work in progress. It has been advanced by billboards, different parts of our country where the message is beginning to sink. Less corruption equals more investment, equals more jobs. In media and commercial ads, town hall meetings, presentations to private and public sector organizations and civil society groups. I want to pause for a moment to share two of those commercial ads with you. One featuring our children, particularly because of the focus of this conference, and the other dealing with an issue, which I shall speak about in a moment, of the greatest outstanding urgency and importance.
Wise up, stop the corruption. It have to stop. It have to stop.
It have to stop.
Stop the corruption. Build integrity.
Yes, ma'am. I will finance you. I think you're going to win the next election. I just need to know how I going to benefit.
See the Chris SUV there? I him a get all of the government big contract them.
Them have to give him. And him support them big time.
Not no left away. That will stop. Jamaica no for run, sir.
And the public make sure how much them give and stop the corruption.
For real.
End secret campaign financing now. Build integrity.
A message from the National Integrity Action Forum.
These and other ads can be seen on our website and have received much acclaim in terms of their helping people to understand why, to put it bluntly, it have to stop. Our role also in advocacy of anti-corruption legislation, for example, special arrangements for the investigation and prosecution of the corrupt. Towards this end, in keeping with the UNCAC requirements, government and public authorities and NIA have partnered in anti-corruption activity, in town hall meetings, in training seminars, many of whom I see beneficiaries of those seminars here present with us for public officials, and in developing policy papers for new legislation. This activity has contributed to the passage of important anti-corruption legislation to heightened awareness of the negative role of corruption and the need for greater integrity. I mention one or two facts insufficiently known. First of all, in Jamaica, by the only scientific measures that have been utilized so far, survey data indicates a decline in what is called bribery victimization, that is, the incidence of persons paying a bribe for a service, whether for a passport, a driver's license, or other such. A decline, ladies and gentlemen, from 36% of the population in 2006, well above the global average, to 12% in 2014, well below the global average, which, by the way, is 27% of people in 107 countries across the world have admitted to paying a bribe for service. This is an important development which can be attributed to the work of institutions represented here, to the work of MOCO. Selwyn mentioned that there are 500 police officers separated between 2008 and 2014. Do you know how much were separated, how many were separated between 1999 and 2003 when I did a study of this factor? 5. 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Between 1999 and 2003. 500 between 2008 and 2014. So I do not believe that this dramatic decline in bribery victimization, as studied by the Latin American Public Opinion Project, is an accident. It is a result of hard work which has to be sustained. Secondly, in terms of the heightened awareness, the Jamaican people, in a recent survey done in December 2014 by the reputed pollster Don Anderson for TVJ RJR, found that all people identified not government mismanagement of the present or past government as the main reason for continuing hardship, not the IMF as the main reason for continuing hardship of so many, but corruption. 2014 survey. And thirdly, many of us recall the positive response to the recent visit and to the call of the South African businessman, Dr. Graham Powell. In less than a week, over 500 Jamaicans, including very prominent individuals, signed on to the unashamedly ethical commitment, including the commitment, quotes, to refuse to elicit, accept, or pay any bribes, and to encourage others to do the same, end of quotes. However, ladies and gentlemen, there remains a major continuing area of the fight against corruption in Jamaica. This relates to the legislative loopholes and the need to close those legislative loopholes dealing specifically with money in politics. Loopholes which facilitate corrupt influence on governance. In that context, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption in Article 7 reminds all the ratifying states, including Jamaica, that you're required, and here I quote, to enhance transparency in the funding of candidatures for elected public office and the funding of political parties. I repeat, Article 7 obliges ratifying countries, including our own, to enhance transparency in the funding of political parties. The absence of legislation requiring transparency in the funding of political parties has constituted and constitutes a major deficiency in Jamaica's system of democratic governance and a huge facilitator for corrupt influence to be exercised on the legislature and on the executive. Hence, in the fight against corruption, the fight for legislation to enhance transparency as well as to regulate party funding and campaign finance, this has been a major area of advocacy of NIA and others. Recently, it must be said that a major step forward was made in this regard with the amendment of the Representation of the People Act, passed by the legislature recently, requiring parties to be registered and therefore meet certain criteria. Can you imagine that for 70 years, the organizations exercising public power to tax you and I, to pass laws, had the legal status of private clubs? Well, the new legislation now requires registration and therefore a degree of supervision. Requires the parties to be registered, giving effect to recommendations from the Electoral Commission of Jamaica approved by Parliament in 2010. However, the critical, outstanding issue of campaign finance reform and regulation of political party funding remains outstanding, long pending, and urgent. Why is this so urgent? Let us be clear. With local government elections due, we are told, in 2015, general elections, national elections, constitutionally required in 2016. In that context, the recommendations and promises from successive governments, recommendations from the Electoral Commission, promises from successive governments, have not led to law regulating campaign financing. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no law in Jamaica specifically prohibiting criminal and illegal organizations from giving money to Jamaica's political parties. That law is urgently needed. There is no law limiting the amount that any individual donor may give in order to buy influence for private purposes without regard to the public interest over political parties. This law is urgently needed. There's no law against foreign entities, whether business or government, giving money to Jamaican parties to meet their interest and to undermine Jamaica's national and public interest. There is no law requiring the disclosure of the contributions to political parties by large government contractors to mitigate the risk of contract awards or other illicit advantage in return for party funding. There is no law requiring political parties to disclose who contributes big money to their campaigns, as exists in 85% of democracies around the world. Of course, no law anywhere else is perfect, but they exist and can be improved. We have to start in order to work on closing loopholes which may subsequently arise. There continues to be an absence of legislation despite many speeches and numerous words from government ministers, past and present, that campaign finance legislation has to be passed in order to rectify these deficiencies. The Electoral Commission of Jamaica, on which both parliamentary parties are represented, placed before Parliament reports and recommendations to regulate campaign finance, reports and recommendations approved by Parliament in November 2010, approved by Parliament again in April 2012, and in August 2013. Yet still no law. In February 2013, Minister Philip Paulwell, the leader of government business in the House, responsible for piloting this legislation, indicated in a letter to me as NIA's executive director, and here I quote, "I expect that campaign finance reform would be promulgated by the end of the first half of 2013. We're now in the first half of 2015, yet still no law. In the most recent debate in the House of Representatives, which approved the ECJ's recommendations, Minister Paulwell stated, and here I quote, "Free and fair elections can be affected by campaign financing because sometimes," Minister continued, "it is who pays the piper that calls the tune." Minister continued, "We have been debating this matter far too long." End of quotes. Hansard report of the House of Representatives debate, September 24, 2013. I agree with the minister 100%. In the fight against corruption, it is a matter of the greatest urgency to end the debating, to move the talk to a final stage, to place the bill before Parliament to regulate campaign financing, to enhance transparency in party funding, in accordance not only with the needs of our people, but our treaty obligations under the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, and to outlaw criminal money getting into our politics. Minister Paulwell, on behalf of the government, asked for support in that debate to enable the drafting of the campaign finance bill, and here I quote, "as quickly as possible, so that before any new campaign period, so that we can get it along before any new campaign period commences. End of quotes. Again, Hansard, September 24th, 2013. I now lend that support to the minister to get this bill in the House and law passed before any new campaign period commences. Are we not near the commencement of a new campaign period? I and NIA repeat support for the urgent tabling of the Campaign Finance Reform Bill, giving effect to the recommendations of the ECJ, and call on the government to ensure expeditious passage of the legislation. We make this call to strengthen our integrity regime and to fulfill our role and responsibility as a civil society organization fighting against corruption in Jamaica. There's no doubt that anti-corruption momentum is growing. This conference is a reflection and contribution to that momentum. Next Monday, at the University of Technology, and all of you here are invited, the head of Transparency International, on my invitation, is visiting Jamaica and shall be the keynote speaker at a conference of UTech and NIA dealing with anti-corruption. The following weekend, there's a 10,000-man march in Spanish Town, dealing with the grassroots communities. The weekend after that, in Trinidad and Tobago, anti-corruption conference sponsored in part by the British Council in that country. So, let the momentum continue, but let it convert itself from debate, as the Canadian High Commission yesterday said, to action, particularly against those who enjoy impunity. Thank you very much.